Greetings and various salutations. Today, for government class, we are doing an introduction to the U.S. Constitution. It's kind of an introduction and an overview. In the coming days of the class, if you're in class in the course itself, we go into more detail and whatnot. Laconically put, the U.S. Constitution is a rulebook for our government. It's designed to limit power, create order, and protect liberty. To go into our learning objectives, we've got three main objectives for today. One, we're going to explain why the Constitution was written and how it replaced the Articles of Confederation, our first attempt at American democracy. Two, we are going to look at the basic structure of the Constitution and its parts. That way, when we dive into more detail, we have a better understanding of where to find what we need to find if and when we need to find it. And number three, we're going to analyze how the Constitution organizes and limits government power. We're going to at least introduce it. So with that being said, let's dive right in. Terms. First thing of the U.S. Constitution is something called the preamble. It's the introduction, and it states the purpose and goals of the U.S. Constitution. Another key term, which we cover perhaps a bit more detail in U.S. history class, and we'd cover it in more if we had went into more detail in like an AP government class. But we have something called the Articles of Confederation, and it is America's first attempt at trying to create a government. Some of these terms are going to sound familiar. A lot from my first few lectures are very repetitive because I'm trying to see, okay, what do you guys remember from maybe a civics class or a U.S. history class, something previously? So if it ever feels like, oh gosh, this is very repetitive, it's because I don't know where you all are coming from, and I'm trying to make sure that I cover things. And sometimes hearing it multiple times or slightly different each time helps people retain what's going on. Anyways, popular sovereignty. This is the idea that power comes from the people, through the people, for the people. That's the idea. Separation of powers. We're looking at how the government is divided up into different parts, such as the legislative, executive, and judicial branch. We're going to look at the separation of powers throughout the entire course, but we're introducing it here today. Checks and balances is the idea that each branch of government can limit the power and abuse of power of another part of the government, and that other part of the government can do the same. Federalism, which will be introduced here and covered more detail later, is the power divided between the nation and the state. Like, how is power divided up in the United States of America? Who's responsible for what? The Supremacy Clause is an important one. It's the idea that the U.S. Constitution is the final boss. I mean, the highest law of the land. It is the instruction manual for the whole thing. Ratification. I'll be honest with you, ratification is more of a U.S. history topic. It's part of the Constitution. It's very important for installing the Constitution, but we focus on the rest of the Constitution when we talk about government and the 200-some years that follow. So, fun fact, the United States of America is technically on our second republic. The first attempt was under the Articles of Confederation, and it really didn't work out in the grand scheme of things. The Articles of Confederation was the U.S. government from 1781 to 1789. It created a weak national government that could not tax. It depended on the states to provide taxes and funding for the central government's operation. It had no ability to regulate trade or enforce laws. The straw that breaks the camel's back, for most people's opinion, is Shays' Rebellion. Shays' Rebellion was a crisis in the state of Massachusetts, where due to high taxes, the American Revolution incurred a lot of debt for each of the states. Massachusetts raised taxes to try and pay off these debts. However, many people felt that they were not being represented. And remember, from the American Revolution, no taxation without representation. Well, you've got people like Shay, who were formerly involved in the Revolution, the fighting part, who realized, the last time we had a problem, we took up arms and overthrew the government. Let's roll the dice and try again. And so Shay and a number of those who were affiliated with him started marching on, I believe it was Boston. And the state militia couldn't be mobilized. The governor couldn't send out the state militia because a lot of those men in the state militia they would have sided with Shea, or they wouldn't have had the heart to do anything about Shea or stop him. And the central government, was either in Philadelphia or New York, I forget which, they really didn't have a way to respond to this either, because they didn't have the resources, the power, or the authority to really step in and to assist the state effectively. The only thing that stopped Shea's rebellion is private citizens, wealthy private citizens put together a private army, and literally that scared off Shea's rebellion. Crisis averted, but not because the government or the state or the national government intervened. This resulted in a fear for the early American Republic, the first American Republic under the Articles of Confederation. If the government cannot respond to a domestic crisis like this, are we going to last? I mean, it's a brutal world out there. There's powerful nations like England and France, and if we don't get our own act together within country, we could fall apart and rejoin or become a part of somebody else's empire. And there would be a lot of suffering in between those things. So a convention is called in Philadelphia, a constitutional convention in 1787, and the purpose of this convention is to fix the Articles of Confederation. But almost upon arrival, everyone says, nope, we're starting over. Let's just make a new document. Let's make a new constitution. Let's try again. Start over. And so they take to this assignment with the goal of creating a stronger central government, but ensure that government protects the rights and liberties of individuals and peoples, and we don't create a tyranny worse than what we had shook off when we drove out the British Empire with French help during the American Revolution. It's a classic painting of that scene. So, long story short, U.S. history class, we go into more detail about the process. The United States of America comes up with a constitution. The framers, that's the writers, the creators of the U.S. Constitution, the people attending this convention, they come up with a new constitution, and it's divided up into several parts, and we're going to look at the structure. First up is the preamble. Think of the preamble as the mission statement, the introduction. I'll read it to you here. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and to our prosperity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. This is America's mission statement. We can break it down. We the people is in big letters. I think I have a picture of it here. We the people. This is a government for the people, by the people. It's in the first line. It's in the big letters at the top. In order to form a more perfect union, we are coming together. We are creating a social contract where we as Americans come together. And we're going to come together to establish justice. We want order. We want law and order in our society. We want domestic tranquility. This one, I think, is probably the most important for many of us. In the grand scheme of things, maybe you don't care about government. Maybe you'll walk out of government class and not really think much of it beyond complaining about property taxes or the election results you don't like. But this is one of the big goals of America. It's so big that they put in the introduction. You want to go about and live your life. You have your own dreams. You have your own ambitions. Maybe you want to raise a family. Maybe you want to do something. Maybe you want to invent something. But in order to pursue those dreams, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, whatever that happiness is, you need a stable environment to do that. You need a space to do that. And the U.S. Constitution lays out that that is something we must do. We're also looking at common defense. We've got to worry about it. There's a lot of dangerous people in this world outside this nation. We need to be able to protect ourselves. Promote general welfare. Secure the blessings of liberty. These ones are important. We want America to be a land of opportunity. We want America to be a land of pursuing your own interests, pursuing your own freedoms. And we want this for ourselves, and we want to see prosperity. That is why we create this Constitution. That is why we live by this Constitution. That is why the U.S. Constitution is the supreme law of the land, is we, the people, are coming together to try and create a society where we can pursue our dreams and ambitions. That is what the framers in a unair-conditioned, window-closed room down in Philadelphia bickered and debated about, as they wanted to create a nation where people could pursue that. And that's the preamble. So the U.S. Constitution is divided up into 7 articles, and within each of these articles there are sections that go into further detail. If you want to think of it this way, the articles are the table of contents, and this is a good piece to know. That way you can quickly find what you need to look for, because quite frankly the rest of government class is just going through the different parts of the Constitution in more detail. Like we'll have a piece on the legislative branch, we'll have a unit on the executive branch, we'll have a unit on the judicial branch, and so on. But here's how the articles break down. The first article after the preamble is the legislative branch. Everything that deals with the legislative branch is detailed here. The framers felt that the legislative branch would be the most important part of the government, and it's also one of the longer sections. Next comes up the executive branch. The executive branch is going to be where you find out about how the president works, and their roles, responsibilities, checks, and whatnot. Number 3 is the judicial branch. This goes into how the courts work. This details the establishment of the U.S. Supreme Court, for example. Number 4 goes into state powers and relations between the states and the federal government. We are a federalist system in the United States of America, and this is where the federalism part of federalism kicks in. What's with the states? How do the states interact with each other? How does the national government fit in? Things like that. Number 5 is the amendment process. There's a certain set procedure for amending or adding to or changing the Constitution. We'll look at it in a future lecture, but at time of recording there are 27 amendments. And each of these amendments, whether it's the Bill of Rights or 11 through 27, they make either clarifications, additions, changes, or subtractions from the U.S. Constitution. But that's another topic for another day. Section 6, Article 6, is the National Supremacy Clause that explains that the U.S. Constitution is the final boss, the highest law of the land. It is the instruction manual for operating this country. Number 7 is important for historical purposes. It's important, but it's more in a historical context. After the Constitution was written in the Constitutional Convention, it needed to be ratified, and the procedure for how that's done is detailed here. Your table of contents. Now, there's some core principles, and a lot of these you might have heard of before, or you might have heard of them earlier, because a lot of them are pulled from Enlightenment ideas, for example. But there's a number of core principles and ideas in the U.S. Constitution. Popular sovereignty. We, the people, we give the government consent to rule. We, the people. That's why the Constitution starts with it. Limited government. The Constitution has a lot of things about what the government is limited in doing or limited in interacting with. Separation of powers, Montesquieu. Each branch of the government has different roles and responsibilities. We have the legislative branch, which has the House of Representatives and the Senate. The executive branch has the vice president, and it's headed by the president. The judicial branch includes the Supreme Court and the other federal courts. But it's divided up, and each has different responsibilities. And we can see that in the checks and balances. And the idea of checks and balances is if power and responsibility is divided, we're less likely to see tyranny or abuse of power. This chart can show us these. Over here at the top of the pyramid of this diagram, we have the executive branch with the president. Their job is to enforce laws. The courts, like the Supreme Court, their job is to interpret the laws. Since we use the common law system, where we look at what's happened, we looked at how we've judged on issues before making a judgment on guilt or innocence or how the law is enforced. Their job is to interpret the laws. Congress creates laws. This is where the I'm Just a Bill song plays in. Now, how each of these branches of government check and balance each other out is detailed in this chart as well. Starting with the President and Congress. Congress, when they make a bill, they send it to the President to be signed off. If the President signs off on the bill, it becomes a law. If the President vetoes the bill, that means the President doesn't approve of the bill and will not allow it to become a law. Congress has a check on this, though, in that Congress can override a veto or rejection of the signature with a 2/3 majority vote. Also, if the Congress feels that the President is violating U.S. law, they can initiate the impeachment process and try and impeach the President of the United States of America and drag him to court. This leads us to the courts. The Supreme Court and the court system, they're the ones that can interpret the laws. If they feel that the Congress is creating a law that they don't approve of, the Supreme Court will declare the law unconstitutional. If a law is declared unconstitutional, that law either needs to be rewritten so that it is in line with the U.S. Constitution, or it needs to be removed and completely discarded. This is, once again, enforcing the Supremacy Clause. The U.S. Constitution is the final say on how U.S. government is run, and if you violate some part of it, you are violating the foundation of the U.S. government. That's what declaring something unconstitutional is about. Likewise, the judicial branch can label presidential actions as unconstitutional. So the president can do things called executive orders. We'll look at them more later. And these are kind of ways of pushing through certain objectives or things in a manner that doesn't require as much approval as, say, running it through Congress. If the courts feel that the president's actions are unconstitutional, it's the same thing as declaring a law unconstitutional. The judicial branch can declare an executive action as unconstitutional. Now, the checks that the president has on the court system is the judges are appointed by the President of the United States. And in turn, those judges are approved or interviewed and then approved of the decision by Congress. You can see the green line here. Additionally, if the president doesn't like a particular judgment, they could issue a pardon and excuse a sentencing by the courts. But the idea is by dividing up the responsibilities and powers of government, we can reduce abuse of power or consolidating of power. Moving on. Federalism, as stated before. This is the idea that each part of the government has different roles, responsibilities, and powers. These are divided between the state and the national government. The last thing that comes up in the Constitution that we're noting here anyways is rule of law. The idea of the U.S. Constitution and U.S. law is that all are subject to the laws of the land. Doesn't matter if you're in charge, doesn't matter if you're rich, doesn't matter if you're poor. On paper, the laws stand for everyone, and everyone is expected to follow them. Moving on. Now, the ratification process also leads us to the Federalist process. The reason we're looking at it here in this class, for government that is because it sets up the Bill of Rights. You look at this a lot more in detail in U.S. history classes, at least where I teach it. But here's the basics. After the Constitution is written, it has to be ratified or approved by the state governments. And this leads to two factions. There's the Federalists, who are pro-Constitution. They're the ones who did most of the writing of it. And the Anti-Federalists, who are worried about the Constitution having too much power. And this was a fierce debate between these two factions. And it was about how much power should our new government have, and how can it protect individual freedoms. That's the basics of the Federalist anti-Federalist debate. First up, the Federalists. Now, the Federalists were the main writers of the U.S. Constitution, and they believed that a strong central government would create a secure nation to defend the liberties of the American people. They believed that a strong government could react to crises and external threats effectively. They felt that the checks and balances that I described before were sufficient and enough to prevent tyranny. Their key leaders included people like Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. To get their point across, they wrote a series of 85 essays called the Federalist Papers. These are still read over and cited today. I think Federalist 10 is a popular one, for example. And they explain how the Constitution will work, and they explain some of the concerns that they felt the Constitution would address. Many of the Federalists felt the Bill of Rights wasn't necessary because they felt the Constitution was enough to limit government's overreach. However, there were a number of Americans who were on the anti-Federalist camp. They opposed the Constitution without certain provisions, like a Bill of Rights, or a listing of rights and securities of the American people. They feared that a strong government would make things worse. We'd shaken off the tyranny of the British Empire, but we could replace it with something even worse if we weren't careful. They believed that local control was the best way to be involved in government. They believed that the local person was concerned about their immediate area, and that getting involved in that local small government, whether it's the state, the city, the county, things like that, they would be able to see the results of their government, and they'd have a more vested interest in the success or failure of that area. People like Patrick Henry, George Mason, Samuel Adams. Now, they didn't publish an anti-Federalist papers series like the Federalists did, but they did do a number of pamphlets and speeches that worried that if the Constitution didn't have certain checks in it, like a Bill of Rights, we would create an elite group of people that run the country. And the anti-Federalists are why we have the Bill of Rights, which we'll look at in a future lecture. Spoiler alert, ratification happens. Enough states approve it, and in 1789, the U.S. Constitution replaces the Articles of Confederation. In 1791, the Bill of Rights is approved and passed, and it sets up the first 10 amendments and many important individual and state protections and clarifications on how federalism will run. Both are still in use. The U.S. Constitution is the oldest national constitution and still in use. It's been changed 27 times, 27 amendments, but largely this has remained the foundation of the government of the United States of America. It's proven flexible enough to get us through the challenges of the American Civil War and the divisions that brought. It carried us through the Industrial Revolution, a couple of world wars, the 20th century and the tyrants of the 20th century and the challenges to democracy there. And it continues to carry us through to the early parts of the 21st century and the age of information. A lot's happened. But the United States has kind of gone from being a backwater republic to becoming a major player and nation in the world. And a lot of it is on the back of this Constitution that a group of men came up with in a hall in Philadelphia. A great deal of bickering, debate, and arguing is what produced this. The Constitution is a series of compromises. It's a series of agreements for a government that we, the people of the United States of America, can live in. Anyways, that's enough for now. Until later.